Okay, so much for my issues. We're going to go through this. You know, Messianic prophecies concerning the lineage of Christ is important for several reasons. And when we look at some of these reasons, and I think it becomes evident, I think, why God made genealogy for the Jews such an important thing. And I kind of went overboard when I went down my rabbit trail about the lineage of Christ. And I know that we're going to be talking about a lot of that as we go through this chapter, but I thought maybe it might be interesting just to go ahead and kind of lay it out at the beginning of this chapter and then address these things as we go through it. Okay. Let's see if I can get this to work. Okay. Genealogies were important because they established the covenant identity with Abraham. For the Jews, that was the epitome of their nationality. It determined which tribe inherited what land when they, is this on? What land they went into when Joshua divided up the land and gave it to each of the tribes. That determined their land inheritance. It governed the religious services. The Levites, certain Levites were priests, certain Levites took care of the tabernacle. And genealogies really preserved the Messianic expectation and the proof of who the Messiah was going to be. So to the Jews, they were very, very particular about their genealogy. Israel was not just a nation, they were God's covenant people. When we look in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, chapter 17 and verses 7, God made certain promises to Abraham. And these promises that were made, the Jews seem to remember them all throughout their history. And even when they were discussing with Christ about who they were and how important they were, they said, we are Abraham's children. They recognized where they came from so many years before. And when God made the promise to Abraham and to his seed, those promises continued through specific descendants. And that's important to know because we know Abraham had two sons, and it went through a specific son, and then as that specific son had children, it went through specific lineages down through that. So to the Israelite, it did not mean ultimately the cultural identity, but it was a covenant relationship. Without that genealogy, they could not make claim to the covenant relationship to Abraham and could say that they were the recipients of God's blessings. So genealogy answered the question, are you part of the people to whom God made these promises? That was the importance of the genealogy to the Jews. Now, when we look at determining the land inheritance, when we see, I didn't put up all the verses on this, but anyway, Numbers 26, verses 52 through 56, we see the land being divided according to their numbers. Whatever numbers they had, this was the land that they were to inherit. Joshua chapters 14 through 19, we see that inheritance being assigned to each of the tribes. Numbers 36 and verse 7, the land was not to pass from tribe to tribe. In other words, it was to remain within that particular family. If you were from the tribe of Judah, if you were the tribe of Dan, or whatever it may be, you received that particular land that belonged to you, and it could not pass from tribe to tribe. So without the genealogy, the land inheritance would fall. It would collapse. It's kind of like today when we have that deed that this little piece of land belongs to me. Well, that's what genealogies were to the Jews. That was the deed to their inheritance, to their land. Without that, they had no claim to it whatsoever. Now, not everyone could serve in the religious service of the tabernacle. Numbers 3 through 4, it says that the Levitical duties were assigned by family. Exodus 28:1, the priesthood was explicitly restricted to Aaron and his sons and his descendants. So when you look at the genealogy, Aaron, your lineage is going to be the priesthood. Now, we see in Ezra 2, verses 61 through 63, that when the people came out of the captivity and were brought back into Jerusalem, they pulled the genealogical records and they started looking at who came from where and who could serve as priest and who could serve in the temple. And it tells us that if any man could not prove their lineage, they were barred from serving in the priesthood because they could not prove their who they were. So it was very important to them. This shows that sincerity in your desire to worship God was not enough. God required authorized lineage to serve in the temple. Very important to the Jews what genealogy served. Now, it protected the purity of worship. God's worship had its boundaries. Number 16, we see where Korah's rebellion tried to assume priestly robes. They were taken care of. Stranger who comes nigh shall be put to death, Numbers 3:10. So genealogy served to safeguard the worship. If you were not of the Jews of this particular family, you could not serve in the temple. And it also preserved the Messianic expectation. Now, we see how it was important to the Jews in that respect, but when we look at the coming of the Messiah, the Jews knew what to look for. It had to come from a specific line. Genesis chapter 49, verse 10, he was going to come from Judah. 2 Samuel 7:12 through 16, he was to come from David's house. Micah 5 and verse 2, as we saw, he was to be born in Bethlehem in Judea. Matthew 1, verses 1 through 17, and Luke chapter 3, we see Jesus' genealogy laid out for us. And it's kind of interesting. Matthew starts out, it says, the book of the genealogy of Jesus. It was a book that was assigned to that family. So without the preserved genealogies, Messianic verification would have been impossible. Anybody could have stood up and said, I'm the Messiah, I'm the Son of God. Well, who are you? Well, that's what Jesus did. He was standing up and he actually said that I am the Son of God. And people acknowledged that because when they looked at his genealogy, he fit the role of where he was supposed to come from. That kind of narrowed it down to who could make that claim. And in fact, and it was kind of something the author pointed out in the book that I really never gave much thought to, never once are we told in Jesus' life that his genealogy was ever questioned. They recognized that Jesus came from the lineage of David and was from the house of Abraham. The promise fit Jesus in that respect, and nobody dared question it because they could not prove it otherwise. Now, genealogies reinforced accountability and continuity. Now, Israel understood itself as a people linked across generations. That's what defined it, was that link across each of the generations before them. Nehemiah chapter 7 and verse 5, the genealogical registers were restored after the captivity. Chronicles 1 through 9, we see this big long list of, this person begat that person, this person begat that person. We look at that and we say, this is mind-boggling. But to the Jews, it was vitally important. So if you ever wondered why chapters 1 through 9 was put in First Chronicles, it was to show the national genealogical record of the important people in God's work. So the rebuilding of the nation itself, the rebuilding of the national memory and the order is established in those 9 chapters. Genealogy anchored Israel to God's past work and their present responsibilities. And actually, it goes forward and shows us the importance of what the genealogy of Christ means to us. Now, this is a long list. And if you've gone to the trouble to download or find my notes, like I said, go to the newsletter, click the link on the last page, it'll take you down there, go to the last entry and you'll find them. But on the notes, there is a chart that kind of lists all this out. And I think it might be good for you to find. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, the promise was made to Eve that the seed of the woman would bruise the head of the serpent's head. We see this fulfilled in Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 14, 1 John chapter 3 and verse 8. So the beginning of really Jesus's genealogy goes back to Adam and Eve and to the promise of Eve that her seed would bruise the serpent's head, and we know what happened there. The second thing that we want to point out in the line of Jesus' genealogy is the line of Seth. Remember, Cain killed Abel, and Abel was a righteous man before God. And Eve says that now God has given me someone to replace Abel, who had been slain. Seth was a righteous man, and now through the lineage of Seth comes the Christ. Genesis chapter 4, 25, and we see Genesis 5, verses 1 through 32. Now, the New Testament fulfilled in Luke chapter 3 and verse 38, when it says that Seth, which was the son of Seth, which was the son of Adam. So Seth was included in the genealogy of Christ, and he was also a righteous man at that time in the early history of mankind. Now we go through the line of Shem. Shem was one of the sons of Abraham, of Noah. And Genesis chapter 9, verses 26 through 27, he said, "Blessed be the Lord God of Shem." Shem was the forefather of the righteous lineage of people coming out into the world. But as you go down through the lineage of Shem, we come to this statement in Genesis 11, verses 12 through 26, that Terah begat Abram, and we know Abram is Abraham. Again, when we look in the genealogy of Christ, he says, which was the son of Shem, that is Abram. Now, we're now beginning to see the picture of Jesus' genealogy. The seed of Abraham, he says, "And ye shall of all families of the earth be blessed." The promise that the seed, that in your seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. Not only is your family, but it's going to be a particular seed. We see the New Testament fulfillment, Matthew 1, verse 1, Galatians 3:16, that seed came through David, and that seed was the Christ. Then we see that it was the lineage was to pass through Isaac and not Ishmael. The prophecy in Genesis chapter 17, verse 9, "You shall call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him. For in Isaac shall your seed be called." The promise was going to pass through Isaac. Again, when we look at the fulfillment of the New Testament, the genealogy of Luke, and Paul making that statement in Romans chapter 9. Then we see that promise was going to pass through Jacob and not through Esau. Genesis chapter 8, 28, "And in you and in your seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed. All kings shall come out of your loins." The promise is made to Jacob. And that fulfillment, we see it in Luke chapter 3. Romans chapter 9 and verse 10 through 13, "It is written, Jacob have I loved, but Esau have I hated." Then we see that he's going to come through the tribe of Judah. "The scepter shall not depart from Judah," Genesis chapter 49. The fulfillment, Hebrews 7, "The Lord sprang out of Judah." Revelations 5, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David. Then we see the house of David. In 2 Samuel 7:20, 2 Samuel chapter 7, he says, "I will set up your seed after you, I will establish his kingdom." David wrote about it in Psalms 89, "Your seed will I establish forever and build up your throne to all generations." Jeremiah 23 says, "I will raise up to David a righteous branch, and a king shall reign." And then we see the fulfillment, Matthew 1, in the genealogy of Christ. Luke chapter 1, it says that the Lord shall give to him the throne of his father David. Acts 2:30, Peter says, "And he will raise up Christ to sit on his throne." And then in Romans 1 and verse 3, Paul says, "Which is our Lord Jesus Christ, which was made of the seed of David." So we know that now that Jesus comes through the house of David to fulfill those prophecies. The line of Jesse, Isaiah 11 verses 1 and 10, says, "A root of Jesse which shall stand for an ensign to the people, to it shall the Gentiles seek." New Testament fulfillment, Romans 15, there shall be a root of Jesse, and he shall reign over the Gentiles. Revelations 22, I am the root and the offspring of David. Now, when we look at all of this, we know that there was a curse placed upon the lineage of one of David's kings. Jeremiah 22, it says, no man of his seed shall prosper sitting upon the throne of David. Now, if Christ came through this lineage, how did he manage to bypass this or overcome this curse to be able to sit upon his throne? We have two genealogies. Matthew records the genealogy of Mary, which is the physical attachment of Christ to all of these prophecies. Luke records the genealogy of Joseph, even though he was not his physical father. That genealogy gave him the legal right to inherit everything that belonged to his ancestors, and that includes the throne of David. So even though he physically bypassed that statement that no descendant shall sit upon your throne. In other words, no physical king will sit upon your throne. From the legal right and from the spiritual right, Christ was entitled to that throne. So he inherits the throne really without violating that particular curse. Now, the fulfillment that Jesus is the Son of God. Now you see the importance of the genealogy of Christ. All of these prophecies, all of these statements throughout the Old Testament, the Jews now knew what to look for concerning the coming of Christ. Now, Jesus is the Son of God. Psalms chapter 2 and verse 7. This was an important passage that all the Jews really knew about. He says, you are my son, this day have I begotten. The entire second psalm is messianic, and as our author says, the prophecies is kind of interwoven into the warlike images of David's reign. So it's there. You just have to see the poetic justice in it. It prophesied of the kingdom of Jesus. And many times the New Testament writers refers to this psalm, applying it to our Lord. They knew what David was talking about in Psalms chapter 2 and verse 7. It was universally regarded by all the Jews as foretelling of the Messiah. The high priest asked Jesus when he was on trial whether he was Christ, the Son of God. Tell me, are you the Christ, the Son of God? This shows two designations of the expected Redeemer. The Jewish priest knew this, that he was going to be the Messiah and that he was going to be the Son of God. Now the question applied to Jesus was, are you the Christ and are you the Messiah, the Son of God? Now Nathanael, when he was being called by Christ, Jesus told him, before I even met you, I saw you sitting under this tree. Nathanael knew the importance of that vision that Christ saw, the importance of what that meant to him, because only the Son of God and the Messiah would know that. And he says, truly, you are the Son of God. Thou art the King of Israel. So we see the fulfillment. We see that the statement made by David in Psalms chapter 2 and verse 7 is fulfilled in Matthew chapter 3, verses 16 through 17. A voice out of the heavens saying, this is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased. A title that was given by God that applied only to Jesus. And it was a title that indicated who would be his son in Psalms chapter 2 and verse 7. So when that image of the dove came from heaven, set upon the shoulders of Jesus, there was an indication that this was the Messiah, that coming was prophesied. Now it also shows us a shared nature of his dignity. The shared nature and the dignity and the love of the Father and the Son. He was the seed of woman. He was the seed of Mary, but not of man. He has no other than the Son of God. Now, I was going to add some stuff in here, but I decided not to. It's interesting. If you've ever read the Quran, I've read it. It's an interesting little book. But they deny specifically they state that Jesus never said that he was the Son of God, and that he was never crucified, that it was Judas that was captured by the Roman soldiers in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he was the one that was crucified. Jesus ran away. I mean, it's a crazy little book, but it's amazing how many millions and maybe 1 billion people that believe this. But anyway, be that as it may, they have no proof that that what they're saying in the Quran is what actually happened. The fulfillment is stated, and even though it was written so many years before, and it was prophesied by many people, the coming of the Messiah came through the promise of Abraham, and he was the seed of woman that was made to the promise of Eve, and he is none other than the Son of God. Jesus referred to him as the Son of God. Now, the religious leaders understood exactly what Jesus was saying. But Jesus, in John chapter 5, Jesus answered him and said, "My Father works until now, and I work." Therefore the Jews sought more to kill him because of this statement. He was saying that God was his Father, making himself equal with God, and to them that was blasphemy, and that was reason to put him to death. If they had only understood the prophets of old, that would have never happened. That all the men should honor the Son, even as they honor the Father. He that honors not the Son honors not the Father which sent him. John chapter 10 and verse 30, I and my Father are one. So he recognizes or at least he is telling man that he is indeed the Son of God, and that he is right to say that I share the divinity with God as his Son on an equal basis. Now, Jesus saying they possess divine nature equally, and the Jews thought that they had need to put him to death because of blasphemy, because the Lord's statement was in fact an assertion of divinity. The law of Moses actually required that anybody that tried to do that was to be put to death. Blasphemy was a cause for death. Problem is, if the Jews would have understood the Old Testament prophecies concerning the coming of the Christ and would have paid attention to what he was doing, they could not have pinned the accusation of blasphemy upon him, because it would not fit. Did you ever read that book, Jesus Before the Sanhedrin? If you haven't, you need to. The seed of Abraham, Genesis chapter 12, verses 2 through 3. I will make you a great nation, and in you shall all the families be blessed. Jesus was the Son of God. We talked about that earlier. Promise is repeated with more specifics, specifically what line he would come through. We talked about that. Now, why, excuse me. I didn't get that all up there, did I? Why the Jews missed seeing Jesus as the Messiah. Now this, I think, is important. They had the scriptures, they studied them religiously, they knew what the scriptures were, of the Old Testament said, and in their expectations of the Christ, they were digging for that information. Now, from a biblical standpoint, many first century Jews emphasized the kingly and the political text while overlooking the suffering and the spiritual nature of the ones prophesied about Christ. You see, they saw themselves, the Messiah coming, he was going to make them a great nation. All the world was going to be blessed through the nation of Israel with this king sitting upon the throne in Jerusalem. That was their concept of what the Messiah was going to be. He was going to raise Israel to a greater stature than what David and Solomon ever brought to them. And in respect, the whole world was going to bow down to Israel. That was the glory that they were looking for. They were looking for a king that was either going to be a wise military ruler, and that was their expectation. But what they refused to look at was the suffering that this Messiah was going to go through. And when we look at that, he says in Luke chapter 24, I just didn't take it off the bottom. verses 25 through 27, and it kind of makes sense when you see what Jesus says to the Jews. He said, "Then he said to them, O fools, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Ought not Christ to suffer these things?" Now, he's saying if you believe the prophets, you would believe about what they said about the suffering of the Christ. And to enter in his glory, then Christ, beginning at Moses and all the prophets, expounded to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. His reference to the sufferings of Christ was something evidently the Jews chose to ignore. And Christ, at this time, pointed it out to them that he was going to suffer. And then he began to show all the things concerning him, and that included the sufferings of Christ. So if the Jews had overlooked that because they were expecting national, national prominence, then they could not see their their Messiah being put to shame through suffering and torture and misery. They just could not see that. So to them, I don't know how they reconciled all of this together, but evidently they chose not to see it. It may be the same way that Martin Luther couldn't reconcile James, faith and works with what his concept was about faith, and so he just chunked James out of the Bible and said it didn't belong there. And so maybe the Jews looked at it from the same standpoint, that they could not see the suffering of Christ, so they chose to ignore it. Maybe it had some other application. We just don't know. But Jesus understood that they did not understand the prophecies concerning that. Now, Jesus was the Son of God. We saw the fulfillment of the record of the genealogy, that he was the Messiah, the son of David. Paul, in Galatians chapter 3, addresses the promises of Abraham, his direct interpretations upon Jesus. And he also argues there that he would be the seed that which all the nations of the earth would be blessed, and not simply Abraham's seed in general. See, they were looking at just the national blessing of the nation of Israel. But Paul was pointing out to them, if you go back and look at that blessing, it was for all the nations. It was not for all the nations to be in servitude to you, but rather it was everyone on an equal basis was going to be blessed by Christ. So in conclusion of all this, you can see I was making all kinds of mistakes here. Genealogies were vital to the Jewish nation. Their lives were guided by family distinction. It identified the Levite priest, and it identified those who served in the tabernacle. You know, that when the law of Moses was being established, God told Moses to separate this particular family of the Levites, this particular family of the Levites. This family would be in charge of putting up, taking down, and transporting the boards of the tabernacle. This one would be the curtains, and this one would be the utensils. All the families had a particular part to play, and it was based upon family. So it identified the Levite priest and those who served in the tabernacle. The land inheritance was guarded by it. If you could say that I'm a particular family, then you were entitled to that particular part of the land, of the promised land. The foundation of the Messiah was his lineage. Think about that. The Messiah, the first thing he could say was, I am a Jew, I am of the lineage of David. Abraham was my forefather, and Eve was my foremother. So the lineage was the foundation of the Messiah. Once that could be proven, then all the other prophecies would need to be applied to this individual. Now, consider this. We do know that in AD 70, the Roman Empire came into Jerusalem and leveled it. They destroyed the temple, they destroyed everything. It was just scorched earth war at this particular time. Along with that destruction was the destruction of the genealogical records. Now, when I think about this, it begins to show me the wisdom of God, even though we think such disaster to Jerusalem can be the wisdom of God? Well, first of all, Jerusalem, those that remained in Jerusalem were the Jews that refused to accept the Messiah. But the thing is that the importance of the genealogy to establish the lineage and the family and the promise in Christ has now been destroyed. There is nobody in this world today can say, I am from the family of Abraham. Think about that. If anybody stands up and say, I am the Messiah, you say, prove to me that you're from the family of Abraham. Can't do it. In the time of Jesus, they could pull the records, they could look at the book of the family of Mary and Joseph, and they could trace him all the way back to Abraham, the promise of the coming of the seed. So in the wisdom of God, he made it a foundation. He made it a visible proof that Jesus was who I promised was going to come. AD 70, he's now put the lid on that box. There's nobody that can say otherwise, and nobody can prove today who they are. Nobody can claim to be a Levite priest. And by doing that, there is nobody that can say, we're going to go back to Israel, we're going to rebuild the temple, and we're going to reestablish the animal sacrifices and the law of Moses. Nobody can do that. Why? Nobody can say I'm of the lineage of Aaron, and nobody can say that I am of this particular house of the Levite nation, or Levite tribe, to serve where I need to serve. Temple worship has been abolished. Our premillennialists just do not understand that. Now, that is the conclusion that we see here. The lineage is important because it establishes Christ. And lineage is important for us to study in this prophecy because it identifies that the statements that were made beforehand are now found in him concerning that. Now, this is kind of an overview of what we're going to be looking at in this particular chapter. And I think that as we go into it, we're going to probably just be rehashing some of this as we go through it. But I think it's important for us to establish it. Put a new slide up. You've got a few minutes here. Questions or comments? Yes, ma'am.
Obviously, during the few hundred years between the end of the Old Testament, they still continued to keep records, but those years are not recorded in the Bible.
Well, they probably existed, but secular records may not be needed for the divine record, if that makes any sense. It's kind of like the statements that we see about certain acts in the Old Testament when it says, are not these acts recorded in the book of Jasher? Well, I don't know if that book exists or not, but simply because it's stated does not mean that it has to be part of the divine Word of God. Now, if there's additional genealogical things that were related to Christ and his family that are not recorded in the New Testament, then it was probably deemed not important. It's kind of like Paul on his road to Damascus. You know, when you read all three accounts says something a little bit different. It's just that at that particular time, Paul decided or chose not to say it, or may have chose to say it in a different way. But what we have, I think, is enough that God has given us to prove Jesus was the Son of God. Anything else? Saved by the bell. We'll look at pages 42 through 48 on Wednesday night. Thank you for your attention.